The political climate had been tumultuous for months. In Washington, whispers turned to shouts, and the air was thick with anticipation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the rising star of the Democratic Party, had been skating on the edge of controversy for far too long. From her bold statements to her fiery social media posts, she had both captivated and enraged the nation. But no one ever expected that her political career would come crashing down in such a dramatic fashion. Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, had always been a thorn in AOC's side. Known for her tough stance on political corruption, Bondi had made it clear that she wasn't intimidated by the left-wing juggernaut. She had her eyes on Ocasio-Cortez, and this time, it wasn't just another political clash, it was personal. Bondi had a trump card, and she was ready to play it. Rumors had been circulating for weeks that a major legal challenge was brewing. Word on the street was that Ocasio-Cortez's activities, both in and out of Congress, had raised some serious legal red flags. Bondi had gotten wind of these whispers, and she had spent the last few months quietly gathering evidence. Now, the day had finally arrived. AOC was about to be hit with charges that would shake the political world to its core. It started with a simple press release, a bombshell that no one could have predicted. Breaking news: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez faces federal charges, the headline screamed. The internet exploded. The charges? Fraud. Money laundering. Misuse of campaign funds. It was a political earthquake. The left wing had already started to rally, claiming that this was just another smear campaign by her political enemies. But Bondi knew better. This wasn't just some politically motivated attack, this was a well-executed legal strategy that had been years in the making. Bondi had been waiting for the right moment to pounce. And now, it seemed, the time had finally come. As news of the charges spread like wildfire, Washington was on edge. Both sides of the aisle were watching closely, knowing that this case had the potential to upend everything. But it wasn't just the politicians who were talking. The media was buzzing, with every outlet eager to dig deeper into the story. Pam Bondi had remained quiet for the first few hours, knowing that the storm was just beginning. She had carefully orchestrated every step of this process. It wasn't about rushing to the front lines with a press conference. No, Bondi's strategy was much more calculated. She had spent months securing the evidence needed to bring Ocasio-Cortez to her knees. As the press conferences rolled in, it became clear that Ocasio-Cortez's campaign had some serious explaining to do. Financial irregularities had surfaced, with large sums of money traced to accounts that couldn't be easily explained. The funds, once believed to have been earmarked for her re-election campaign, seemed to have been funneled elsewhere, funds that could potentially land her in hot water for violating federal campaign laws. AOC's team immediately went into damage control mode. They issued a statement claiming that the charges were politically motivated, part of an ongoing Republican strategy to discredit her and derail her career. This is just another attempt to silence a progressive voice in America, AOC declared in a fiery social media post. But it was clear that the walls were closing in. Bondi, though, was relentless. She wasn't in it for the headlines or the sound bites. This was a methodical legal battle, one that she knew she was going to win. The evidence was solid, and AOC's attempts to deflect were growing weaker by the day. Behind the scenes, Bondi had been in close contact with federal investigators, making sure that every step of the investigation was handled with precision. She knew that one misstep could ruin everything. The last thing she wanted was for this high-profile case to crumble before it even began. In a private meeting with her legal team, Bondi laid out her next move. "We hit her hard, and we hit her fast," she said with cold determination. "We make sure that every detail is exposed to the public, and we never give her a chance to recover. This is bigger than just one politician, it's about sending a message." Bondi's confidence was unwavering. The battle was far from over, but she could already see the writing on the wall. Ocasio-Cortez's fate was sealed, and no amount of deflection or outrage could change that. The days following the announcement of the charges saw an explosion of media coverage. The country was divided as it had been many times before, but this time, it felt different. The left-wing media rallied behind AOC, decrying the charges as politically motivated. To them, it was just another attempt by the GOP to silence the rising progressive star. But on the other side, the right-wing outlets were having a field day. News anchors gleefully dissected every aspect of the charges. Conservative pundits were practically dancing in their seats, thrilled at the prospect of seeing one of their fiercest adversaries taken down. At last, justice is finally coming for AOC. One headline read. And while many were celebrating, others were skeptical. Questions swirled about the strength of the evidence, and some wondered whether this was merely a distraction tactic in a year marked by contentious political battles. But Bondi wasn't concerned about the naysayers. She had seen the evidence, and it was damning. Her next move was nothing short of spectacular. In a surprise press conference, Bondi took to the stage, flanked by federal investigators, her steely gaze fixed on the cameras. The room fell silent as she began to speak, each word calculated and precise. Today, we are not just exposing corruption, we are sending a message to every politician who believes they are above the law. No one is untouchable. Not even the darling of the left. Bondi's tone was cold, unrelenting. She released a series of financial documents, detailing the transfers of funds from AOC's campaign into accounts with questionable ownership. She even played a recorded phone call between two individuals discussing how to conceal the funds, their voices chillingly calm. It was clear to anyone who was watching, this was no ordinary scandal. This was a well-coordinated operation that was being unraveled piece by piece. The reaction was swift. AOC's supporters were livid, accusing Bondi of being a pawn in a larger political game. But the cracks in AOC's defenses were starting to show. The social media posts grew more frantic, and her public statements became increasingly desperate. "I'm not going anywhere," AOC declared, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "This is just the beginning of my fight." But Bondi could see that the pressure was getting to her. The progressive firebrand had always thrived on the media spotlight, but now, it was clear that the spotlight was burning her. Behind closed doors, Bondi knew that this was just the beginning of a much longer battle. But in the public eye, she had already won. The momentum was shifting in her favor, and the stakes were higher than ever. With each passing day, the walls around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were closing in tighter. The media frenzy, the relentless accusations, and the growing legal pressure were taking their toll. Behind the scenes, Bondi knew the case was nearly airtight, but it was the public perception that would ultimately seal AOC's fate. She wasn't about to let the left spin this into a victim narrative. The damage had already been done. The federal investigation, once seen as a distant and impersonal process, had now become a spectacle in its own right. As more evidence emerged, bank statements, emails, and testimony from former allies of AOC, every piece of the puzzle fit into place. It became harder and harder for even her most loyal supporters to deny the truth. Even her colleagues in Congress, once quick to defend her, were starting to hesitate. It was the bombshell that Bondi had been waiting for. AOC's closest campaign advisor, someone who had been with her from the start, flipped. The advisor, once a trusted ally, now spoke to investigators in exchange for immunity. The information he provided was devastating. He detailed how Ocasio-Cortez had used her campaign funds to funnel money into private investments, then personally benefited from those investments, all while lying to her donors and the public about her financial needs. It was a betrayal from within, and it rocked the core of AOC's defense. Bondi, with her sharp instincts, had anticipated this. She knew that in the cutthroat world of politics, betrayal was sometimes the final blow. And now, she had the perfect leverage. She released a statement, quoting the advisor's testimony in chilling detail. "This was not an accident," Bondi said with icy precision. "This was a calculated, deliberate act of fraud. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez manipulated the trust of her supporters and violated federal law for personal gain." The public reaction was swift. Those who had defended AOC with fervor now found themselves in an uncomfortable position. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. Congressional Democrats, previously hesitant to take action, now found themselves in a delicate dance. Some called for an investigation, while others urged Ocasio-Cortez to step down. But the damage was done. AOC's once untouchable status had crumbled, and now, she was a politician fighting for her political survival. The political pressure was mounting. Bondi, always several steps ahead, knew the next move would be critical. She wasn't just aiming to take down one politician, she was aiming to set an example, to send a message to anyone who thought they could get away with abusing their power. Ocasio-Cortez was cornered. The legal battle was intensifying, but so was the media assault. It was no longer just about the charges, it was about her reputation, and no amount of deflection could fix the growing distrust in her leadership. The weeks leading up to Ocasio-Cortez's trial were a whirlwind of chaos. Her every move was scrutinized, every word dissected. The once confident Congresswoman, who had so easily commanded the attention of the nation with her fiery speeches and bold rhetoric, now found herself stumbling to keep her footing. The scandal, once a distant rumor, had become an undeniable truth, and it was sinking her career faster than anyone could have imagined. Bondi, ever the strategist, had remained in the shadows, letting Ocasio-Cortez's missteps speak for themselves. While AOC desperately attempted to frame the situation as an attack on her progressive ideals, Bondi was playing the long game, meticulously preparing for the upcoming trial that would determine the fate of the embattled Congresswoman. The moment arrived. The trial was set to begin. In the grand courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. News outlets from across the country were watching, and the political world held its breath. On one side sat AOC, flanked by her defense team, trying to maintain an air of defiance. On the other side sat Bondi, poised and confident, with the weight of the evidence on her side. The opening statements were a study in contrast. AOC's lawyer painted her as a victim of a corrupt system, a young woman targeted for her bold ideas and progressive values. "This is not about justice," her lawyer declared, his voice filled with indignation. "This is about silencing a voice for change, a voice that dares to challenge the status quo." But Bondi's response was methodical, devastating. "This trial is about one thing, accountability," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "We are here today because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez violated the law. She used her position, her power, to enrich herself at the expense of those who trusted her. This is not a witch hunt, this is the pursuit of justice." Bondi's team presented the evidence with military precision. The financial records were damning, clear evidence of Ocasio-Cortez misdirecting campaign funds, using them for personal investments and luxury expenses. Witnesses, including former campaign staffers, testified about the behind-the-scenes efforts to cover up the illicit activities. But the final blow came when the advisor who had flipped onto Bondi's side took the stand. His testimony was crushing. The advisor detailed how he and Ocasio-Cortez had worked together to divert campaign funds into offshore accounts. He described how AOC had instructed him on how to cover her tracks, using complex financial maneuvers to hide the transactions. It was a textbook case of money laundering, and it had been done with the calculated precision of a seasoned criminal. The courtroom was silent as the advisor finished his testimony, his words hanging in the air. AOC, once so outspoken, now appeared small, her face drawn with the weight of the accusations. It was clear, the public had already convicted her, and now it was only a matter of time before the legal system followed suit. As the trial continued, it became evident that the momentum had shifted irreparably. Ocasio-Cortez's once ardent supporters were beginning to waver. Some had already turned their backs, while others tried to distance themselves from the scandal. It wasn't just about legal charges anymore, it was about the public perception, and AOC's image had been irreparably tarnished. Bondi, however, remained unshaken. Her victory was within reach, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone stand in her way. The final arguments were set to take place the next day, but in the back rooms of the courthouse, the pressure was mounting on AOC. Would she cave before the trial even reached its conclusion? Would she cut her losses and resign, sparing herself the final humiliation of a guilty verdict? The courtroom was packed for the final day of the trial, but the tension in the air was almost palpable. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had long been a symbol of defiance and rebellion against the establishment. To see her reduced to this moment, the final stretch of a once promising political career, was a sight few could have predicted. Her team had put up a valiant defense, but the overwhelming weight of evidence was impossible to ignore. The damning testimony from her former campaign advisor, the financial records that exposed her corruption, and the string of cover-ups had painted a picture so clear that even her most loyal supporters were starting to question her innocence. But AOC, ever the fighter, refused to give in. In the final hours of the trial, it all came down to one last battle, Ocasio-Cortez's defense team versus Bondi's prosecution. The stakes were higher than ever, but in the end, there was no escaping the facts. Bondi took the floor one last time, her voice steady and unyielding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have presented the truth. The truth is clear. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez used her power, her influence, and the trust of her supporters for her own personal gain. This wasn't a mistake, this wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate attempt to defraud the public, to defraud the very people who believed in her message of change. And for that, she must be held accountable." AOC's defense team tried their best to salvage what was left, but it was too little too late. They claimed that the charges were politically motivated, that Bondi's crusade was just another attempt to crush a progressive movement that had gained too much momentum. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence spoke for itself, and the public had already convicted her in the court of public opinion. As the jury filed out to deliberate, AOC sat silently, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. This was it. This was the moment when everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for, was slipping away. The deliberations didn't take long. The jury returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. The room erupted in shock and disbelief, but to those who had watched the trial unfold, it felt like the only possible outcome. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the star of the progressive left, was now a convicted felon. Pam Bondi stood tall as the verdict was read, her expression stoic. This had been her moment of triumph, years of work, strategizing, and patiently waiting for the right time to strike. The charges against AOC had been a well-executed operation, but it had been the final push of Bondi's relentless pursuit of justice that had sealed her fate. As the news of the verdict spread, the political world went into a frenzy. For Ocasio-Cortez, the future was uncertain. Would she be sentenced to prison time? Would her political career ever recover from this scandal? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, Pam Bondi had delivered a decisive blow that no one could ignore. In the days that followed, Ocasio-Cortez made a public statement. She didn't apologize, she didn't admit guilt. Instead, she lashed out, calling the entire process a witch hunt and a conspiracy to destroy her movement. But her voice lacked the fire it once had. The people who had once rallied behind her were now divided. Some still believed in her cause, but others were left questioning whether they had been deceived all along. Bondi, on the other hand, was now the undisputed victor. Her political rivals had underestimated her, but she had played the long game, and now, the fruits of her labor were clear for all to see. The message was loud and clear: no one, no matter how popular, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The dust had settled, but the political ramifications of the trial were only just beginning to take shape. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's conviction had sent shockwaves through Washington, igniting debates on both sides of the aisle. For some, it was a victory, a clear example that even the most powerful figures in American politics could be held accountable. For others, it was a tragedy, proof that the system was rigged to destroy the very people who fought hardest for change. For Pam Bondi, the fallout from the trial felt like both a personal victory and a professional milestone. She had made her name as a tough prosecutor, but this was more than just a case, it was a statement. Ocasio-Cortez had been a force in American politics, but Bondi had taken down the giant, proving that no one, no matter how beloved or influential, was beyond the reach of the law. In the days following the verdict, Ocasio-Cortez faced mounting pressure from both the media and her colleagues. Calls for her resignation grew louder, and soon, even her closest allies began to distance themselves from the scandal. Her political future was in ruins. While she maintained her innocence, the public's perception had shifted irreparably. The charismatic congresswoman, once seen as the voice of a new generation of Democrats, was now a symbol of betrayal and scandal. The sentencing phase of the trial was quick. The judge, noting the severity of the crimes, handed down a sentence that was both a warning and a reminder of the power of accountability. Ocasio-Cortez was sentenced to several years of probation, along with community service, but the damage to her career was far greater. She had been stripped of her position, her reputation, and her future as a political force. Meanwhile, Bondi's career soared. The legal community hailed her as a fearless defender of justice, and her reputation as a no-nonsense prosecutor was cemented. Politicians, once wary of her, now looked to her as a formidable ally, or an opponent to be reckoned with. Her victory in taking down AOC had solidified her place as a rising star in the Republican Party. But the victory was bittersweet. Bondi knew that this case would follow her, just as it would follow Ocasio-Cortez. The political world was forever changed. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party would never be the same, and the fallout from the case rippled through the nation. In the years that followed, Ocasio-Cortez attempted a return to politics, but the scars from the scandal never fully healed. She became a shadow of her former self, an embittered figure who had once been a beacon of hope but was now a cautionary tale. Her name became synonymous with scandal, and though she continued to speak out on issues of social justice, her voice lacked the power it once held. Bondi, on the other hand, continued her ascent. She became a prominent figure in the Republican Party, admired for her strategic mind and unyielding approach to justice. But even as she basked in her success, she knew that the political game was never finished. New challenges, new enemies, and new battles were always on the horizon. And for Bondi, that was exactly how she liked it. The AOC scandal would remain a defining moment in modern political history, a stark reminder that the line between hero and villain in Washington could be paper-thin. It was a lesson in the fragility of power and the unforgiving nature of politics, and for Bondi, it was a legacy she would carry with her forever. The political storm that had shaken the nation had finally passed, but the echoes of the battle would continue to reverberate through the halls of power for years to come.